Good evening. My name is Megan Neer, and I am pleased to welcome you to the Community Science and Technology Virtual Seminar Series sponsored by Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. This seminar series is intended to introduce you to the world-class research that has been taking place right here in the Tri-Cities community for more than 50 years. And normally it is held in person at a local library, but given the current unfortunate COVID-19 situation, we modified the format and hope that you'll enjoy this virtual seminar. We expect to continue having one virtual seminar per month from here on out for the foreseeable future. More information and registration for these seminars can be found on PNNL's events page, which is pnnl.gov/events. Now I'd like to take a moment and do a couple of quick polls. We are interested to know where you are joining us from. And we also are interested to know what best describes the stage of your career. If you can see that and want to start answering those questions, that would be great. And if none of those communities or career stages match up with what you have, go ahead and put something in the chat box and we'll see it there as well. Looks like most of our folks are from Tri-Cities, and we've got one from Seattle, a lot from the late career and retired, and we do have students early career and mid-career. So it looks like we've got a nice mix of folks tonight. And we've got somebody calling in from Oregon. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'll go ahead and end that polling now. So thank you. At the end of tonight's talk, it would be greatly appreciated if you could take our brief survey. The survey link is shown here on the screen, and it's also in the chat window. You can copy and paste it right into the browser of your choice. For your convenience, we'll display and share the link again at the end of tonight's talk. We really appreciate you taking time to give us your feedback because we want to make sure that you see value in these seminars, and we'll make improvements based on your feedback. This is also your opportunity to sign up to receive emails from us about upcoming seminars. Before you learn about tonight's topic, your presenter is going to give you a brief overview of the National Laboratory System and PNNL's missions. You will also learn a little bit more about Battelle, the operator of PNNL since 1965 and the Tri-Cities' largest employer, and its staff, and how they take pride in being excellent community stewards through philanthropy and volunteering. Now let me introduce tonight's speaker so we can get started. If I can stop sharing. There we go. So let me introduce your speaker. Nick Betzold is a data scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. His research focuses on risk assessment and mitigation, as well as big data analytics and visualizations. Nick holds an MS in data science from Northwestern University and a BS in applied statistics and analytics from Brigham Young University. Tonight's presentation is implementing a vision to create and deploy the airport risk assessment model. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So as Megan said, my talk is about the airport risk assessment model, or I'll commonly refer to it as ARAM throughout this presentation. Another plug for the survey that was mentioned at this link there. The feedback is greatly appreciated. All right, so I have a few slides up front about the lab, as was said. So Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is one of 17 U.S. Department of Energy labs across the country. Here are a few of the primary examples of how PNNL advances missions of the Department of Energy. So starting in the top left, for scientific discovery, PNNL operates national user facilities such as the Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratory, which is open to users across the nation and globe. So what's shown in the picture is PNNL researchers using mass spectrometry or proteomics research that enables detailed visualization and analyses of cellular proteins. For energy independence, PNNL is a national leader in battery development. For example, PNNL created a new anode that quadruples the lifespan of lithium-sulfur batteries, making it a feasible option for a broader range of storage options. For environmental management, to address radioactive waste issues at the Hanford site, PNNL created a process called vitrification, which can safely store radioactive waste in glass form for thousands of years. And national security, that's the group that I'm a part of. PNNL is a leader in chemical weapons forensics, including identification of signatures that may provide important clues to the origins of chemical weapons. As far as employees and payroll go, from fiscal year 2019, there were 4,722 total employees, and PNNL spent a total of about $1 billion. For intellectual assets, again, from fiscal year 2019, there were 265 invention reports. There have been 4,470 cumulatively since 2000. And there have been 88 US and foreign patents in FY19, 2,800 US and foreign patents since 1965, and 34 license agreements with commercial companies in FY19. The total economic output in Washington State was $1.46 billion, and that was from FY18. PNNL contributed the $1.46 billion in output, 7,180 jobs, and $732 million in Washington State wage income through closely related economic activities such as visitors, healthcare spending, retirees, and companies with PNNL roots. Those companies with roots at PNNL, there are 193 companies established since 1965 with technological or managerial roots at PNNL. And since 1965, Battelle has invested more than $28.5 million to improve science, education, and quality of life in the Tri-Cities community. Half of philanthropic dollars are given to STEM education efforts. Over the past 10 years, through Team Battelle, our staff volunteer program, PNNL staff have volunteered 347,000 hours to more than 120 community projects. Employees volunteered 30,000 hours to 56 local organizations in FY19 alone. And if you couldn't tell, that's not part of my presentation. I was reading from a script there, but it gives you a good background of where I work, the things that the lab and Battelle are doing. But here's an agenda for what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll go over some background about what the ARAM tool is. We'll go over some risk basics, what we mean when we're talking about risk and how we quantify it. And what does risk, these terms that come from Department of Homeland Security terminology, what do they mean when applied to the ARAM scenario? We'll talk about where ARAM started and where it is now. And I'll show I have demo in quotation marks. Live demos are dangerous, and so I just have screenshots to show you guys today, and then we'll take questions at the end. So the airport risk assessment model, it came about due to another risk project that we had going on at the laboratory that predated my time at the lab. But it was called the Risk Reduction and Resource Allocation Model, or 3RAM for short. And this was a risk model specifically for the Washington State ferry system over in the Puget Sound, over by Seattle, that area. The federal security director for the state of Washington for TSA over at the SeaTac airport on the west side got a briefing of the 3RAM model and thought that it would be perfect to apply to what he does, securing our airports over there at his airport. And so with his help, we at PNNL developed the first model to dynamically quantify risk from terrorist threats at airports. And one of the great things about the ARAM model is it can automatically optimize their available countermeasures, which helps to improve the overall security at the airport. And we've demonstrated this model to the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Division, to folks at TSA, Port of Seattle Security Police, Delta Airlines as well, and we've also begun expanding to new airports. The tool itself has been operational at SeaTac since September of 2019. And as I said, there are additional airports to follow. And this is a project that's sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology APEX program, which takes on a breadth of airport-related projects. Okay, so let's talk about what we mean by risk. Risk is as coming from the Department of Homeland Security risk lexicon, the potential for an unwanted outcome to result, and determined by its likelihood and associated consequence. So we want to take this risk and turn it into a numerical score. And we do that by creating a mathematical function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So the threat piece, you can see there in the little box. You can think of that as how likely is this terrorist attack to occur. Vulnerability can be thought of, how difficult is it for the adversary to be successful at implementing and carrying out their attack. And consequence then is what's going to happen. How impactful is this attack going to be? This figure is a roadmap that kind of showcases what pieces go into applying this risk methodology at an airport. So we begin over here on the left side with the red box where we define airport areas and vulnerability nodes. So we have to take what the security stakeholders in an airport, they have a conceptual mental model, if you will, of what their airport is like and the risks associated with it and how to mitigate those risks. And so we want to take that mental model and put it down to pen and paper. We start by saying, okay, these are the physical locations throughout the airport that need to be protected. And within those areas, where are the actual places that countermeasures would be assigned to mitigate threats? And those are the vulnerability nodes within airport areas. You can kind of think of them in math terms, it's like elements that are, items that are elements of sets. We outline specific threats, such as a personal born explosive, chem bio attack, active shooter, whichever specific threat types are most pertinent that you want to be able to defend against. Once you have those items, the next thing to think about is your countermeasures that are available to you. So what are you going to be able to deploy throughout the airport to help reduce the risks of these threat types? So here's an example list of potential countermeasures that exist in the airport space. Canine units, airport police department patrol units, and so forth. For each of these countermeasures, we have subject matter experts, stakeholders at the airport. So they provide scores for how effective these countermeasures are against the threat types. And we do that in two different categories. The first is this prevent and detect. So how good are these countermeasures going to be at attacks that are already underway, at preventing and detecting them? And the other side of that coin is deterrence. Can these countermeasures be effective at preventing an attack from even occurring in the first place? Can they deter an adversary from wanting to try? And you'll see that these feed into the three components of risk mentioned earlier, consequence, vulnerability, and threat, and I'll get to that in a second. But in between these two major boxes, there's this data input section. And this is where we have to think about specifically people is the big thing on our mind here. That's a big driver of the consequence section. We want to know where are people throughout the airport at a given point in time. So we look at numbers of employees, whether that's at the vendors, at the different shops within the airport, perhaps vehicles that are commonly trafficking throughout the airport, passengers, so flight logs, people going through the security checkpoints on an hourly basis, and so forth. We also look at the number of flights coming in and departing the different terminals each hour of the day as well. So these data sources and the countermeasures, they work on these three components of risk. So we'll take consequence first. That's the expected outcome of the attack. We've broken down consequence in our model into these 7 different subcomponents. Death and injury is the primary one that's affected by the number of people, as I mentioned before. We also consider things like economic impact, any impact to the environment, sometimes some indirect things like national defense or symbolic effects. Now the risk score is unitless, and so we have our subject matter experts provide scores for these different risk metrics on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. And then we have functions on the back end which translate these to a risk score. And that allows us to be able to compare things like death and injury, dollars from economic impact, and so forth, all on the same scale. Vulnerability. So with vulnerability, we have these four main subcomponents: availability, accessibility, organic security, and target hardness. The organic security component is where we get the effect of the countermeasures with their prevent and detection ability. And so if the countermeasure is particularly effective at preventing and detecting attacks, then they're going to have the effect of lowering the vulnerability and therefore lowering the risk score. And then the threat likelihood, that's the relative likelihood that this attack type will actually occur. And the deterrence effectiveness for a countermeasure works to lower that threat likelihood. So we take all these data sources, the scheduled availability of countermeasures, and the population flows throughout the airport throughout the day. They all get fed into a risk engine on the back end of the ARAM tool. And this takes into account all these pieces and determines the optimal recommended schedule for these available countermeasures. And once they get that assignment, they go throughout the airport and fulfill their assignment, and that helps to lower risk at the airport. The chart along the bottom is showing the red line is the unmitigated risk, so the risk, what it would be without deploying any countermeasures at all. And the blue line is how much you're able to lower that by deploying your countermeasures. So you can see at some hours of the day, perhaps when you have more countermeasures or more effective countermeasures, you're able to see a larger gap between the red and the blue line. And it results in an overall risk buy down, we say, of 26% out of 100. As I alluded to, the risk engine is driven by an optimization algorithm. So we build a math program formulation which consists of an objective function. We want to minimize daily risk at the airport. Our decision variables, these are the things that we can manipulate. So that's where and when to place our assets or our countermeasures. And then there are certain constraints, right? So perhaps the assets aren't available 24 hours of the day. Perhaps they have their limited schedule of availability. Perhaps there's things like a countermeasure can only go to certain locations. Maybe they're restricted from accessing a certain portion of the airport. So these are constraints that need to be fed into the model to make sure that the results that we're getting are not only optimal but also feasible. And this is a plot that we like to show that compares the different kinds of risk. So on the y-axis, we have a risk score. And as I said, this is unitless, so that the actual value isn't super informative all by itself. We're more interested in comparing two risks scores. So maybe a risk where we started and a risk where we ended up with our countermeasures. That's why that buy down is an important metric. So the red dotted line we call baseline risk. This is what the level of risk is at the airport without considering any people, without considering any population movements, any data sources, any data of employees and things like that. No countermeasures being assigned. This is how our security stakeholders at the airport have scored their airport based on the consequence, vulnerability, and threat. And then from there, we start slowly reducing the risk. So the blue line represents how the risk changes dynamically throughout the day when you factor in passengers, everyday people that are boarding and leaving planes and how they're moving throughout the airport. The yellow line here represents sort of the routine assignment risk buy down. So before we had the ARAM tool, security stakeholders at SeaTac and other airports, they go about their daily business based on what they're used to trying to achieve. And they kind of have maybe a gut feel of what the risk at the airport is like. And so they don't even necessarily know where these lines are, but they're still getting some sort of buy down. So there's a key benefit of ARAM is that by quantifying risk, you can actually even see where this buy down is at. And then further beyond that, we can get down to the green line by using the ARAM tool to optimize the countermeasure assignments. And so with this, we're able to show how you can be even better, basically, with the countermeasure assignments. So when I started at the lab back in 2016 as an intern first, and then continued on until I became a full-time data scientist here. So when we first built this model as sort of a proof of concept of what we could do for TSA, it was all based in Excel. So it was a fairly fancy Excel spreadsheet where we had a tab where they could input a starting shift time and an ending shift time for a certain countermeasure type. We had all the scores built in, and I had written some Visual Basic code on the back end so that the user could push a button and it would run Excel's solver engine to determine the optimal schedule for their countermeasures that they inputted. And we get the risk binom metric with this little circle graph at the top. And we can see how risk was distributed with the sand chart there, or by the bar graphs for the different areas. It was very slow, very clunky, but it got the point across of what we were trying to achieve and what we could show, that the different types of analytics we could do. So fast forward now to where we're at currently. We have a fully web-based tool. Users can log in with their email and a password. We have a nice fancy risk gauge with a functional heat map that's tied into the different areas that they define. And it's much nicer, much faster as well. Before we get into some of the screenshots that kind of showcase that web-based tool in action, I'll kind of quickly review a workflow that covers the concept of operations, so how the tool is used at a high level, and then I'll kind of show how the airport can be set up, and how you can schedule countermeasures and get some results and see the effect of adding your countermeasures in ARAM. So ARAM operates on sort of 3 layers of adding countermeasures. And the first we call fixed countermeasures. So these are assets that perhaps don't have a lot of flexibility. Maybe they're not even within your organization's jurisdiction. So let's say, for example, that TSA is using the model, and they're also working with the Port of Seattle to secure SeaTac Airport. TSA won't have any control over the Port of Seattle countermeasures, but they also want to get credit for the assignments and the shifts that they know that they do. And so they can add in Port of Seattle countermeasures to specific locations at specific times during the day. And that will prevent the ARAM tool from duplicating effort. They won't assign new TSA countermeasures to those same locations if they could get more buy down somewhere else. Once we have that first layer in, then we can do planned countermeasures. And these are sort of what I've been talking about, where we have a certain number of available countermeasures, what their shift times are, what their type is, and put those in and say, let ARAM decide where they should go. And they're optimally dispersed throughout the airport, minimizing that duplication of effort, like I said before. And this third layer that we add in, we call unplanned countermeasures, or sometimes we refer to them as subscribers. And these are people who they'll have an account on the ARAM tool, and they aren't necessarily scheduled at a certain time within the tool to be somewhere. Let's say that I'm an employee for TSA, and I have an account on ARAM, and I'm doing whatever it is my normal day job requires. Maybe I have a meeting or something that I'm at, and it ends early, and I find myself with an extra half hour of time, and I want to contribute to buying down risk at the airport. I can log in quickly to the tool, say that I'm available for a half hour. It'll have my countermeasure type, and it'll tell me the best place to go to minimize risk for that next half hour. So it's a much more flexible layer than either of the previous two. So we'll get into some of the screenshots from the tool here. So all of the users of ARAM, they have an email address and a password set up with their account. When you put those in, it'll ask you for a security code as part of a 2-factor authentication sequence. And that security code, it changes it all the time. And so it'll be unique with each login. Someone who's a higher level, more administrative stakeholder at the airport will get to see this dashboard view. And so they'll get to see the risk for the day with this risk gauge, as well as an hour by hour snapshot of how that risk is changing throughout the day. So right now you see the line is only red. That's the unmitigated risk. There's no countermeasures deployed at all. But you can see how it changes with the forecasted population of people, right? So it's low risk at the early hours of the morning, much higher risk as you get around 6 a.m., 8 a.m. or so, and then it sort of slowly tapers off throughout the day. We get a heat map to see where risk is highest throughout the airport. And we also have a bar chart to show the breakdown of risk by area. And then it's cut off here on the right, lower right-hand side, but this is, this shows the different types of countermeasures, how many have been deployed, how many hours they're getting credit for within the tool. So let's move on to configuring an airport in the tool. So the first step, if you can remember back to the roadmap, that flow diagram, is to identify those physical locations at the airport that are important to protect. These can be things like baggage claim, the checkpoints, curbside areas, the departure gates, those kinds of things. Those are often fairly common between airports, but they will be unique as far as maybe how many of each kind you have, depending on like the number of concourses, for example. Once you have the areas defined, then you need to know where are the specific locations within those areas that countermeasures are going to be assigned to. And these are our vulnerability nodes, those elements within sets. And so, for example, a baggage claim vulnerability node can belong to the baggage claim area. Oftentimes, the relationship is one-to-one, but there were a couple of unique scenarios that we needed to capture, which is why we have it set up this way with this one-to-one or one-to-many relationship. For example, there is a vulnerability node that we wanted to capture called catering. And this vulnerability node can actually it can provide access to any of the secured areas. So any of the concourses where planes take off from. And so there really isn't a catering for each one of these individually, but from this one catering vulnerability node, you could jump off to any of these secured areas, which is why we have that one-to-many relationship here. And so the user would add in all of the different vulnerability nodes and define these relationships like this. Next, they add in all the different countermeasure types, and they define where the access is on the right-hand side with these checkboxes. So in this example, the TSA K9 team cannot access the cargo, catering, or checked baggage zone vulnerability nodes, but has access to all of these other ones listed there. We also need to define what our threat types are, the things that we need to defend against. This is a pretty basic list of typical threat types that we see here stakeholders are interested in. Workers with access is also referred to as insider threat. Other things we've started to think about, COVID is one that could potentially, it's not necessarily a terrorist threat, but if you had countermeasures that were available to help reduce the risk of COVID, that would be able to be factored into the model. We've done a tiny bit of preliminary work on that this past summer with some interns. Other threats that we've talked about including would be drones. That's hot on people's minds. It's difficult to know what countermeasures would be available against drones specifically, or cyber threats are another one of interest. And the last tab here is a randomization factor. So that's kind of a component of deterrence. If you can make if schedules are always optimal and you always have the same countermeasures available, and the risk scores don't change a lot from day to day, then the schedules could start to become predictable. So we use a randomization factor to sometimes assign countermeasures somewhere completely random throughout the airport and not to the optimal place, to help create some uncertainty in the mind of an adversary. And so that value, that deterrence or that randomness factor can be increased or decreased depending on the user's preference. Once the airport's configured, then we need to add in the risk scores. And so they're organized here by the threat type. If we expand one of those threat types, like active shooter, then you can see this is where the user would input their risk scores on a scale from 1 to 5. And the threats input for each, or the threat score is given for every area. Same with consequence, but you'll see with consequence that we have the different subcomponents that I mentioned before. So economic impact, environmental impact, and so forth. I don't have any screenshots of it here, but this little tiny question mark, if you click on that, up pops a sort of help or a help window that provides some definitions for some terms, some guidance criteria on how to score these different components. And then vulnerability is slightly different than threat and consequence. As sort of suggested by its name, it's actually done at the vulnerability node level and not the area level. But those are also scored for each of the 4 subcomponents of vulnerability. And then we also score the effectiveness of the countermeasures for the specific threat, in this case, active shooter. So yeah, detect and prevent and the deterrence effectiveness. So this needs to be done for every threat type, for every area threat, area consequence combination, area vulnerability node and vulnerability combination. It's a lot of risk scores. I think at CTAC, it was somewhere around the order of about 1,000 parameters that needed to be set. That's quite a burden on users that we're aware of. We've spent a lot of hours with our stakeholders at CTAC helping them go through this process of scoring. And it's something that we've been looking at in more recent phases of work for how we can streamline that process. What are ways that we can alleviate some of that burden? And some of the things we're looking at specifically deal with artificial intelligence and how we could maybe provide some automation to this task. Perhaps providing an auto-generated band of scores that the user could choose from where we think the risk score should typically be, as well as the ability to sort of update these in near real time as live events are happening. For example, say there's a news report of a truck with explosives that's been stolen from somewhere nearby. That might need to elevate the vehicle-borne threat in some locations. And that would be a way to be able to do something like that with much more flexibility. So once the airport's configured, all the risk scores have been defined. The main functionality of the tool is the scheduling piece. So this is the screen where they can input the schedule by clicking the green Add Shifts button. It asks you for what the countermeasure type is, how many there are, what day to be assigned, when their shift begins and when it ends. The drop-down menu where it says let ARM decide, if you click on that drop-down menu, it will also show you a list of all of the vulnerability nodes. And so if you were to assign somebody to a specific vulnerability node, that would be the same as the fixed countermeasure layer that I went over earlier. Letting ARM decide is the optimal, or the letting the tool decide where the people should go. And that would be the planned countermeasure layer. And then you click the green check mark, and that adds in that specific countermeasure, and you can repeat as necessary with the add another shift button. So here's a sample of 5 different countermeasure types that have been added. And sometimes they have more than one specific team to them. So those individual teams are flexible to go anywhere throughout the airport. And we call this green Get Schedule button the easy button. All the user has to do is click this, and it will say, ARM will come back with where the best deployment of all of those countermeasures are in the airport. And once you do that, here's a sample view of what the schedule looks like, sort of in a timeline mode by each countermeasure team. So for example, the first block is the air marshal. We just had a short 2-hour shift, and it's going to spend the first hour at the baggage claim and the second hour at a security checkpoint. So you can see easily where all of these countermeasures are assigned to go throughout the day. Here's an alternative view of the schedule that also tells you whether or not it was optimal or whether it was random, as well as how much risk buy down was achieved. Once we have all these countermeasures input into the tool, we can come back to the dashboard and see what the overall effect on risk was. So there were a total of 13 countermeasures that were input there on that previous screen. And it's cut off here, but it was a total of 74 hours between all of those teams. We got the risk down 41 points so we start every day normalized at 100% risk, and we were able to buy it down to 59% remaining for a buy down of 41%. And you can see the blue line here now on this line graph is showing how that risk was bought down throughout the day. Obviously, that window of time there is where countermeasures were assigned, and where it's just the red on the outside, that's where there weren't any countermeasures available. So you can see we did a pretty good job of reducing risk there in the middle of the day where the countermeasures were. And the heat map and the bar charts update in real time as you add these countermeasures as well. The heat map has a cool function of being able to we can zoom in on it. And so what we are able to see here is color-coded heat map of risk. So the green areas are low risk. Actually, the dark areas are the lowest risk. And then red would be the high-risk areas. At the top, we have the expected number of flights, as well as passengers on those flights departing at a specific hour. So we're looking at 3 p.m. on this particular day. The toolbar on the right lets you sort of slice and dice this data to suit your needs of the metrics that you want to look at. So an alternative thing we could look at, we could change the color scheme to be more monochromatic. This is helpful for those who are colorblind. And in this case, we're now looking at population as our key metric as opposed to risk. So the areas that are darker are going to be the areas with the most people in them for this particular hour. Now the little white boxes with the numbers in them, those are the number of countermeasures in that area. So a lot of are in these vulnerability nodes. So in a lot of them we have zeros, but we see we have a couple with one team in them. And here's another alternate view that's showing the number of countermeasures. So at 4 p.m. we had most of our countermeasures at this secured area, and it looks like at maybe the curbside location there. So to summarize what we have with the ARAM tool, we have a risk-based approach to be able to decide what the best use of these limited resources are. It's something that's basically impossible to do in somebody's head. And we have a way to quantitatively defend decisions that we believe to be optimal to lowering risk at the airport. We can account for multiple threats all at one time. And we can also improve the unity of effort across these stakeholder organizations, right? So we see diminishing returns if you start having too many countermeasures in a specific location at the same time. So it encourages more coverage throughout the airport. With specific metrics like risk and risk buy down, we can look at trends over time, and the stakeholder agencies have their targets to work towards now as well. And as always, we're aiming for ease of use. We want the users to want to be able to use these tools. That's perhaps the most important thing. I'd like to acknowledge some of our sponsors and those that we've been working with on these risk-related projects. The Department of Homeland Security is the big one, TSA, as well as the Coast Guard, Washington State Patrol, and others. So that wraps up what I have for my talk. Did you want me to show the next slide for the next webinar, or hold off on that after questions?
Sure, you can share the next slide. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, yep. So a reminder, here's the link for the survey. We really value your feedback. And the next webinar will be in December with Allison on engaging the future of STEM workforce through their teachers.
Well, great.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Nick.
much for your time, for attending this talk.
And thank you, Nick.
Yep.
We appreciate you taking time out of your day to discuss your research, and we know the audience appreciates it as well. We do have 21 people on the call right now, so I'll go ahead and jump right into the Q&A portion of this evening's program. Did your work identify areas that were exploitable that maybe CTAC officials weren't aware of? For example, an area of high consequence for which they had no countermeasure, or conversely, a place that might be vulnerable but of low consequence if exploited?
That's a good question. I don't know if we found anything that they weren't aware of. We've been definitely learning with our contacts at TSA how the model responds to their scoring. So a lot of way that we've set up the model, where it requires a lot of stakeholder inputs to the scores, they're obviously going to drive what a lot of the outcomes for risk are. And in our talks with them, we found that risk was overwhelmingly higher at the front of the airport, which makes sense, right? Because things like the curbsides, the areas right where you walk into the front of the airport, those are the most open. They have the least amount of barriers to be able to get to them. But if you have too much risk at the front of the airport and not enough at the things behind security, for example, we were seeing how that could perhaps dominate some of the scheduling, where countermeasures were always being assigned to a certain, like just to those areas in the front of the airport. So that kind of gave us and TSA some insights on how the risk function sort of worked in this space.
Great, thank you. Are there any other potential areas of application for this model?
Yes, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, the ARAM project got started because of a previous model we had built that was for the Washington State ferries. We have had talks with folks from the US Customs and Border Protection about doing a similar risk methodology for protecting our borders. I've been involved on a project trying to work up a proposal for work that would look at doing a similar model for the seaports, again with Customs and Border Protection. And we've also done some work with optimal resource allocation for the Customs and Border Protection laboratory techs, those who are analyzing samples of things that are seized and sent to labs for further inspection, helping them reduce their backlog and things like that. So short answer is yes, this methodology is certainly applicable in other domains.
Great, thank you. And how does the information or risk state flow from the physical location, like baggage claim, into the tool, and how is that quantified? Is it automated or manual?
That's a good question. Perhaps the person who gave that question, could they elaborate a little bit more?
I will see what we get in the chat window.
Only have access to the chat. Okay. Can you read the question one more time?
How does the information or risk state flow from the physical location, like baggage claim, into the tool, and how is that quantified?
Yeah, so it's, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's pretty static. It's really dependent on how it's scored up front with those consequence subcomponents, vulnerability subcomponents, and the threat likelihood. As far as if information were to change in real time, there's not a great way to be able to do that on the fly right now. That's some of the work we've been looking into with artificial intelligence that I mentioned before. If there are sensor technologies that we could integrate with that would help provide recommendations to change those risk scores in near real time as new information is available about the state of those locations.
Okay. And when you talk about mitigated, does that mean dispatched or does that mean resolved?
That's a good question. I would say in this context, it's definitely reducing risk. So you know, this space is particularly difficult because we're talking about a non-event as a success. So how do you quantify or determine the success of something like that didn't happen? Did you know that it was because of what you did, or because they weren't trying on that particular day, that particular time? So yeah, I would say that mitigating has to do more with how did our relative risk change? Or were we able to lower it from where we were currently at?
Okay. And how do you account for the human elements? Does the tool take into account things like possible insider threats or people who have a grievance, anything like that that you can speak to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Insider threat's a tricky one. It's a threat that we've included in the model because it's important to our stakeholders. There's room for lots of debate on how accurate that assessment actually is, right? We dedicated at least one summer with a couple of interns who came from the Air Force Academy, and they did specific research into like human factors, perhaps things that could make an employee a higher risk for an insider threat, or insider attack. But we haven't yet specifically integrated that into the tool. It was more just some side research. This was something that was really important to people at CTEC after the man stole the plane, right? And he took off and ended up crashing it over there in the Puget Sound area. So insider threat is hot. It's definitely on the forefront of the minds of folks at TSA, and it's something we're working to improve.
Well, that answered the next question. That particular situation or scenario example was in one of our other questions as well. So thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
So you showed us an application for SeaTac. Are there any other airports that are lining up to utilize ARAM?
Yes. So we've had specific talks with Portland. There was a member who was with TSA who since moved to a leadership role with the Port of Portland. And she's been kind of spearheading the ARAM integration effort there in Portland. We've also built out versions and demoed the tool for Denver International Airport. And actually just this morning, we gave a presentation to the two Washington DC airports, Reagan and Dulles. And they're very excited and on board with being able to implement it. We have done the work necessary to take our population forecasts and estimates at CTAC and apply them to the top 100 airports in the United States in terms of passenger volume. And that allows us to be more flexible in spinning up a new airport as they become available, as users want to start up the tool for their airport.
Okay, thank you. And we do have one last question at this time. The scores provided by airport security leaders seem subjective. What can be done to reduce that bias in the model?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. It is definitely subjective. First to that, I would say that having a risk score is better than not having a risk score. And these folks who are providing the inputs, we definitely aim to have multiple people we'll call it a panel, who determine these scores. So we want folks that have a lot of experience in this domain. So at CTAC, we had our security director for the state of Washington at TSA. He had people and his staff that were part of explosives detection, people who worked on some of their, they're called Atlas teams. they had people from the Port of Seattle police department and their security forces, people who are canine handlers. They wanted lots of different perspectives on how people view the airport, and what they each bring their own mental model to the table, and it kind of provides some diversity to how they come up with these risk scores. But the subjectivity still exists, right? And that's another area where data and statistics, artificial intelligence, these kinds of things can help improve upon that. Access to data is a difficult thing. As I mentioned before, we're in a domain where there aren't a lot of historical events to go off of with accurate information. And so there's going to have to be a hybrid of the two wherever we end up. But I think we can use the subject matter scores, and we can combine it with as much data as available to assist with maybe updating those scores in real time, if not even recommending where to set them in the first place.
Great. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's seminar. Nick, thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule, and everybody for attending, for taking time out of your busy schedule to learn about the research. Nick, for sharing your research with the community. We appreciate it. So at this time, I'd like to remind everybody one last time to take our brief survey. You can also sign up for email notifications about future seminars at the end of the survey. And also, please note that we do have another webinar coming up on December 1st, as Nick mentioned. Allison Colotello will present Engaging the Future Workforce through their teachers. The link to register is in the chat window, or it will be soon, and we hope that you'll join us. Please note that the December webinar will start at 5 p.m. instead of 7 p.m. We did hear some feedback there, so yes, we do listen to your feedback and appreciate it. So again, thank you so much to everyone who joined. We hope to see you when we have more seminars. Like I said, after December, we're still working on getting those scheduled about once a month. So we hope to see you again soon. Everybody have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.